Welcome to You Rise Me Up, a podcast about Asian Europeans from all walks of life. I'm your host Ching, a German-born Chinese. Today with me, Baling Le, the co-founder of Frontline, a startup developing an AI-powered risk assessment tool to end domestic abuse sooner. The software is used by social services across half of Germany. This year, Baling was also named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 Europe list for the social impact she's making. Born and raised in Germany as the daughter of Vietnamese contract workers, Baling studied area studies at Humboldt University and public policy at the Hertie School. She's worked on data science for good projects for years and is now the chief data officer at her own company. I'm excited to talk to Baling not only as a fellow Asian European, but also as a woman in tech who's not just building, but also leading the technical side of her own company. Thank you very much for taking the time, Baling.
Of course, thank you for having me.
So, Baling, what was it actually like for you to grow up in Germany?
In my opinion, growing up in Germany was something I was very fortunate to be able to do because that gave me access to a lot of resources, but also difficult in certain rights, such as the usual everyday racism. I was born in Berlin and then moved to Saxony for 4 years of my childhood. Now I'm back in Berlin. I very much enjoyed growing up here in Germany.
How did your experience in Berlin compare to your experience in Saxony, especially since Berlin is so international? I'm also curious if you had a lot of Vietnamese friends growing up and what that was like.
I did. I grew up in the best part of Berlin for Vietnamese people, which is the east, Lichtenberg, Frankfurt Allee. This is a Vietnamese hood. I was really fortunate to have 7 Vietnamese people in my school, which is a lot. And in Saxony, that changed because I was suddenly the only Asian in a majority white dominant environment. The kids loved me. I loved the kids. I mean, we were all kids. Unless you were a mean kid, everyone loved everyone.
Since you mentioned that you grew up in the best part of Berlin with several Vietnamese kids in your class, did you feel like it gave you a stronger sense of belonging from the start?
Maybe. I've never really thought about that. Because even though I've been surrounded by Vietnamese most of the time, we didn't really talk in Vietnamese. I was part of the second generation Vietnamese German diaspora, not of the first generation, which is a huge difference. That is because I don't speak Vietnamese that well. I've gone to school to improve it. It's now much better. In my childhood and in my teenage years, my Vietnamese was quite lacking. And that's because my parents are really hardworking. Most of the time, they worked 6-7 days a week. And then in my teenage years, I started seeing them more, working alongside them in the Asian bistro. But we only talked about what does the customer want? Does he have any allergies? And is it takeaway or eating here?
That sounds so familiar. I think it's similar with Chinese parents that had a restaurant that they were also very hardworking and working 24/7. How has your relationship with your parents evolved over time, especially given the language barrier?
It's still very tricky, but then my parents, I very much love them. It's important to know that the reason I'm learning Vietnamese is obviously to connect with my culture. But also, a big motivation is just to talk back to my parents.
Were there a lot of times where you just couldn't talk back?
Exactly, because I didn't know. I was like, this is clearly a stupid line of argumentation. Doesn't make sense whatsoever. It's not benefiting them. I couldn't say that because I didn't know how to. And obviously, you don't ever talk back to your parents. It's disrespectful.
But then being able to talk back, did that actually improve the relationship or did it actually make it worse?
We're moving to a point where my parents start to respect my opinion more. There's still fields where they're like, no, you don't know shit. You haven't gone through all of this and you don't know Vietnamese culture as much as we do. I respect that because they might be right. Just because I'm reading and consuming a lot of information and talking to other people doesn't mean that I know Vietnamese culture or that specific part of Vietnamese culture as much as they do. That is totally right. But also my perspective might just be as valid to consider.
Do you actually have siblings?
I do. I have a twin pair. I'm not part of the twins. 2 sisters and 1 younger brother.
Wow, Vietnamese twins. That's also quite rare, no?
Yeah, exactly.
Do you feel like your parents treated you differently as the first child?
Absolutely. I was the one to be sent to all the meetings and calls and to take charge of all the correspondence with authorities. So I totally have eldest child responsibility syndrome because being the oldest sister, I had to take care of a lot of things and grow up faster. Sometimes that also meant foregoing some of the childhood experiences.
Does the degree of connection with the Vietnamese culture vary across siblings? I do feel like that is the case with my siblings, that our connection or desire to learn the language or curiosity about the culture and the country varies quite heavily. Is that the same for you and your siblings as well?
Definitely. At some point, we all had the same level of Vietnamese language skills, which was around A2 or B1. I am progressing now to B2. My sisters, on the other hand, they're in a special situation because they have a Vietnamese boyfriend. They always have to visit the Vietnamese parents of their boyfriends, and they are to the Vietnamese language much more often. The only people I really talk Vietnamese to is my parents and a friend I made over tandem. I actually have to actively do lessons to maintain and improve my language skills. My sisters and me are very much interested in maintaining our skills, and my brother is a bit less.
When did you actually visit Vietnam for the first time, and what was that like for you?
The first time I visited was probably when I was 11 or 12. I think I was just fascinated by everything I saw and everyone I met. There were all of these strange people having some resemblance of my mum and my dad, saying, "Oh my gosh, we've seen you in pictures." But I remember having the best time because we didn't take holidays often. So these big Vietnam trips over summer, very special to me because we got to go on a family vacation. Some of it was very arduous and it's annoying, but for the majority of it, I had a splendid time.
That's very nice. I just remember having a huge culture shock when I first visited China. That's why I'm always curious what other people's experience was like.
I was also very popular because back then, the game console and all the cousins wanted to play, and I was very much a brat. So you can play, but what do I get in return?
When I'm talking to people, I'm sometimes comparing their experiences with my own in my mind. And I was just thinking, I think that your experience was probably quite different, also partly because you still have close relatives in Vietnam, because I actually don't. So it was just my sister, my mom and I exploring the city. And my mom is also quite removed from Chinese culture already. She is still quite Chinese, but because she grew up in the Netherlands, none of us speaks perfect Mandarin and all of these things. The degree of foreignness just increases across generations. And that is probably why. Because I was just thinking, I was like, why didn't I? And then I was like, oh, I don't even have cousins in China. I didn't have a game console in China either. But I was like, maybe that would have changed the experience.
Yeah, the first instance is to feel like you're missing out, but it creates another opportunity to, rather than just be exposed to something your whole life, you get to learn about the culture on your own terms, rather than having different perspectives of that culture imposed on you to create your own unique world of it. Hopefully also in the future, your own little community.
It's a beautiful way of looking at it, Baling.
Back in 2018, I think, I actually stayed with my grandpa in Saigon for 2 months, which I don't recommend. We clashed all the time. There was this intergenerational clash, and then there was this culture clash.
Do you have specific examples of those clashes?
I wanted to go out and experience the nightlife. Do people go to bars? Do people do clubbing? What do young people do in the evening? My grandpa was very strict and of the belief that people would kidnap me. And so I shall not do that. Or I could only do that in the company of other people.
How would people know that you're a foreigner? As long as you don't open your mouth, right? They probably wouldn't be able to tell.
I've been told that you can tell. Talking is the first giveaway. Even if you don't talk, it already starts nonverbal by the way you clothe and the way you move around and behave yourself, because Westerners, we're much more comfortable with taking up space. That's my perception. It might not be relevant for all parts of the country and the culture, but I feel like Vietnamese women are more likely to behave different. Oh no, you do that, and no, I can sit here. I can stand here and you sit there. Things like these, people notice.
That remind me of that one time. I used to work in Beijing for some time, and one of my Chinese colleagues actually told me that she's also able to tell that I'm not from China. And apart from my Mandarin skills, was the fact that I look at people in public when I'm in the elevator. I look into their faces and I smile. And I was like, what's wrong with that? And she was like, Chinese people don't do that. There are so many people that everyone just tries to stay in their own line and they try to look down or away, but they don't look people in the eye. So I was just like, oh, wow, I never noticed that. I thought that was quite interesting. But Baling, what led you to study area studies and public policy?
My education in Germany was all about Germany and Europe. And so my first instinct was to learn about the world outside of Europe, which is why I applied to the Humboldt University for Area Studies Asia Africa. And I also took the opportunity to learn Vietnamese and Chinese. I also learned Chinese, funnily enough, to piss off my parents. Because they were like, why learning the language of the colonizers? And I just thought to myself, it's like the top 3 languages spoken in the world. Obviously, I'd learn it. That's where I also made a lot of my friends, including my co-founder.
How did you actually know that your co-founder was the right person to found with?
I was very fortunate to meet my co-founder in the most organic way possible, working together. Because my co-founder and me didn't know each other beforehand, he had posted something on his Instagram stories. We were connected because all of the Hertie people wanted to be connected with each other on Instagram, but we've never really talked. One day I saw him post a story about wanting to do a master thesis on domestic abuse. And I was like, yeah, hell, I'm in. I started talking and then proceeding to doing our master thesis on toxic masculinity as a proxy for domestic abuse, the refugee camps in Kurdistan, Iraq. It was really fascinating to do this research in the first place, find out that we both have this common interest in domestic abuse, realize that we work quite well together. By the end of it, when we submitted our master thesis, he asked me, Baling, do you want to found a startup to end domestic abuse? I was like, yeah.
What were your personal motivations in terms of where did his and also your interest come from?
It's unfortunately a really known fact that not everyone, but almost everyone that works in domestic violence is working in that field because they either have direct or indirect experiences of domestic abuse themselves. That is also the case for me and my co-founder.
How did you then start Frontline?
We thought, let's run a survey to see what kind of support services people talk to. First, it was obviously friends and family. But then second, interestingly enough, were colleagues and employers and HR at a workplace. So it made sense to teach workplaces how to identify and then also how to recognize and support colleagues living with abuse. So we piloted a workplace program with SAP and Dativ, which was quite successful. Then pivoted towards the institutional support system, police officers, social workers, because we felt the need to make sure that if victims reach out, the support systems are equipped with the best tools possible to actually help them. Because currently, what happens after recognition is a sort of assessment. It's questions such as, has he ever hit you? Was you pregnant? Does she ever feel the need to control all sorts of aspects of your life? That's a very general wording, but questions such as these are used to assess the risk of repeat abuse, the risk of severe abuse, just the general kind of abuse you're experiencing. That is important because this assessment is used to determine your support. If the assessment is bad, that means you won't get the kind of support you might need.
Is that because the questions are either not answered honestly or the wrong questions are being asked?
I think it's all tools, because the ones we do have, is currently in place in Germany, developed in 1986. Things such as digital abuse are not in there. They didn't exist then. but they're really important parts of our lives now. And it's important to consider these as mediums through which you can enforce manipulation and threats. What we proceeded to do is look at all the papers, study how they build their tools, look at the future directions. There's always a chapter called Future Directions, what things they would have had in mind for new iterations or more developments of risk assessments. Just implemented them in our tool, Lizzie. Lizzie is not a revolution. She's just an optimization, like a lot of optimization steps.
Since we are talking about domestic abuse, what are some key signs that people can look out for when it comes to recognizing that someone might be at risk?
People just slowly disappearing from the social context. That is a huge sign. But also like other things are going into the other direction, i.e. people that want to stay at work as long as possible, because once they go back, they have to face abuse again. So anything that starts dipping out of the norm in an extreme way. The most important thing to keep in mind is focus on your concern for their well-being. Put aside all assumptions, because they might feel the pressure to perform. They might feel like you're asking them because you notice that they're slacking off in terms of work performance, and you don't want to have that effect.
You mentioned you started with the workplace and then you pivoted to working with governments and the institutions that actually address this problem. What was that switch like, and how did you actually manage to get these institutions to implement your tool?
When we were still working with workplaces, we're essentially a B2B startup, business to business. So having media coverage helped in terms of getting customers. That is not the case. Social services or governments. There's only one instance where someone told me, oh, I found your Stern article. That's how we found you. Every other person, every other organization heard about us from someone else. And I think they underestimated the degree to which mouth-to-mouth propaganda just matters in these kind of circles. It's a lot of networking, it's getting in touch with people, showing them you're a real person and not here to scam them. The viewers or the listeners can't see me, but what they should know is that I'm 150 in size, and my co-founder Babs is black and 190. Once we meet clients in person, it always brings them a smile on their face.
It's interesting because I think that Asians, we tend to look younger on average, or at least like from non-Asians' perspectives, they tend to assume that we're younger than we are, which is already quite tricky when you are in very serious fields, I find, because people tend to associate youth with less experience. But Baling, I also remember that we talked about our experiences being a woman in tech, because there are already quite few women in tech. What has your experience been like being the chief data officer at your company?
My company is quite small. I think everyone acknowledges my expertise in the field of statistics and of data analysis, but I also work with incredible people. So within the company, it's great. I love it. It's brilliant. Outside of the company, I have to make the case every single time. I don't really love to drop terminology on people, but I have to. So they get a sense that, yes, she's not just a cute face. She's also got, she actually knows her shit. In very rare instances, there's no need to show my expertise whatsoever because they already acknowledge it. Maybe if I was a man and I wasn't 150, things would be different.
You are a mighty 150, Baling.
Baling is actually a male name too. I once Googled Baling in Vietnamese, and all the people that showed up were men. And I think my mom gave me that name because she's just thought, Berlin, Baling.
Do you yourself experience imposter syndrome?
I did. I used to do. Sometimes I oscillate between, I'm the most brilliant person ever, to, I'm so stupid. And it's two extremes. I'm aware of that. And I tend to be in the middle. I'm quite cognizant of things I don't know. And more importantly, I recognize that I don't know what I don't know. In terms of imposter syndrome, what helped in my case is zoning into the nitty-gritty details. So instead of thinking to myself, I'm not good enough, I think about what are their skills. Is there really such a huge difference? There's a reason why I dared to be in that field, because I think that I have what it takes to be in that field.
I think you went from growing up as the child of contract workers to now co-founding and leading a tech startup. In that context, how do you think about socioeconomic mobility, or have you ever reflected on your journey from that perspective?
Yeah, I was incredibly fortunate to be able to rise in that regard, because social mobility in Germany compared to other countries is really difficult.
This conference I went to recently, where a woman who moved here from Ukraine at a young age and also ended up building her own company. She was basically poor growing up. She also noticed differences. She had to learn certain things. Like, for example, she was mentioning how she was once at a dinner and she learned that you would get different kind of wine with every course, or that in some circles, they would talk about things like golfing and skiing all the time. These were, of course, activities that she had never experienced growing up. There was a lot that she had to learn on the way, but also the topic of conversations would change and the social context would change quite a lot as she moved up the social ladder as well. And I was quite curious if you made any such experiences as well.
Definitely. The first big one was transitioning from high school to my undergrad. I came upon a lot of people who were highly educated, who not only learned so much about Asia and African histories, but also actually went to these places, who could afford just doing holidays there or doing internships there. Very impressed, but also intimidated. I also had this slightly smaller transition from my undergrad to my master's. There, then I came upon people who did work in politics or already worked in consulting groups and higher management and had these skills and these competences, which was really cool. But I think by that time, it was less intimidating and more just me fangirling. I'm turning 29 this year, and I think nowadays, sometimes it's still intimidation, but most of the time it's just admiration and respect.
What was it like for you to be named on the Forbes 30 under 30 list? Was it an active goal of yours? Did it just happen? Did it change anything about your life, your work, how you present yourself? Because being part of the list, you also become a public role model, right?
So the whole thing beforehand was quite anticlimactic. It just seemed very scammy, and said to myself, this is phishing, for sure. Just put it in the junk folder. And then I looked up the people and asked my co-founder, and he's, I think that is legit. I think you should answer that. And I then sent a very long survey and forgot about it. And then at some point I received a follow-up saying, oh, can you just send us your ID to verify your person? Because I didn't send it the first way around. Because I have no way in hell am I sending my ID to these people I don't know anything about. I guess that's the German in me. But then I did send it to them and then saw the congrats. I was like, oh, cool.
How did your parents respond to you founding and leading a company?
Terribly. They hated it. They wanted me to go into secure and reliable employment, because they are essentially the founders themselves. They founded a restaurant. So the business owners, you know that this can be quite taxing. It stands and falls with you. They wished for me not to pursue the same. I'm fully aware of the fact that I would earn so much better if I just work as an employee rather than running my own business, but I'm stubborn and I really want to make a change in that regard. That is actually something that I really care about, having impact in the world, even if it's a really small thing. Just leave the world a bit better.
That's very admirable. That's also a common misconception, that people think that anyone who found something is earning a lot of money, but the initial years are always more about survival. And it really is a long-term game when it comes to entrepreneurship, that I have also learned and observed for sure. On this journey, what have you learned or unlearned about yourself?
Being defensive about my work, something I unlearned. I'm saying this in such a nonchalant and chatty way. It was actually quite some work I had to put in to unlearn this, because I think it's a natural instinct to be defensive and possessive about the baby you've just created over the last couple of months. So I unlearned to be possessive and defensive about my work, and I learned to be quite pragmatic and outcome-oriented.
I credit my mom for actually making me quite receptive to feedback because she criticized me so much growing up. When I was younger, of course, I reacted negatively to it. She always told me, no one will ever be as honest with you as your mom. And I'm only criticizing you because I love you. She could have communicated her feedback better because there is a subtle difference between criticism and constructive feedback that I know. But at one point, I did realize that what I perceived as constant criticism actually made me more receptive to feedback later on, also in the workplace and elsewhere. And now I'm thankful for it. Ba-Ling, given everything that you've been through and have experienced so far, what advice would you give to your younger self?
I think I've started quite late networking effectively and enthusiastically. You're talking to me now, and the listeners have heard me speak. And so you'd think I'm a quite outgoing person and an extrovert. And I can be outgoing, but I'm actually an introvert. And this used to be much more pronounced. And only recently, in the past couple years, I've become more outgoing, which helped in getting better at networking. I guess it is an egg and chicken problem. This is really important in the field if you want to be a startup founder, because networking is everything, not just in terms of getting to the right investors, but also the right people to listen, clients, the customers. But yeah, you need to really do a lot of networking. Nowadays, if I go to conferences, people know me. I'm at these conferences at least once a quarter. And sometimes there's a prize like, oh, you're also here. Yeah, of course I would. And so now I'm in touch with all the big sector organizations. They know me by my name at least, or by the Frontline tag, or by face already.
What about on the personal side? What advice would you give your younger self when it comes to managing your emotions or cultural identity? What is something you would say to your younger self on that front?
Start journaling sooner. I've come to the realization that sometimes just talking through things or writing down things is very helpful, and it helps you process things in a way that you would otherwise not be able to if you just thought about them or pushed them aside. Journaling creates a safe space for me where I can just blurt out all the thoughts in my head without any kind of judgment. I don't journal every day. I only journal when I feel like it, or when I feel like something's simmering inside of me. But it makes a difference. Sorry to sound so stereotypical, but journaling helps.
No, I don't think it's stereotypical. I think there are a lot of people who actually haven't made use of it. I've basically been journaling since I was 7, and I think it has really helped. Thank you so much for taking the time to take part in the podcast. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. I did too. Thank you for the opportunity to first talk on this podcast, and thank you for doing this in the first place.
And if you're a listener who's enjoyed listening to the podcast, you can now support it via buymeacoffee.com/yourisemeup.podcast. Thank you.